production cost to measure against it. So it was usually like the Marvel stuff and that kind of thing. So the chat's live. So if anything, if you guys do see anything in the chat, oh yeah, you just said that.
You don't have to worry about the chat.
Okay.
Let me see if I turn this off.
All right, you guys are live and ready to go.
We are? All right. Welcome everyone to this incredible lecture. It's an honor for us, for Chris and for myself, to introduce someone that we have been following. I have been following Ryan for the last 15 years, since the time we have blogs. I don't know if you guys remember, probably students that we have right now, they don't know what a blog is. But before Instagram and I think Facebook was there, but we had blogs and we used to follow each other. And it was the only way that we could share our work and see what other artists that we admire they were up to. So it's an honor for me today to present Ryan Wood. He's a phenomenal designer, someone that we admire immensely. He's an art director, a visual development artist. He has worked everywhere from Warner Brothers to Disney, Blizzard, Nickelodeon. He's also a teacher, and he teaches at the University of Utah. And a personal note, something that I loved about his work is the ability that he has to successfully blending together the line quality of drawings and value into color. Like they merge together. You kind of see it and you kind of don't, and that's it. His design sensibility feels something tangible for me and traditional about his work. Like it feels like it's with digital, but it could be with acrylic or with oil. That's something that I love and I admire about his work. And also for our students that are in my class, my students, when we do maquettes, I present the Disney Infinity characters, you know them. Well, Ryan was one of the designers behind them. So without any further ado, it's a pleasure to present Mr. Ryan Wood.
Thank you. And thanks to everyone for the nice words and the invite to do this. I'm looking forward to just walking through some work and everything. So if at any time, this is sort of a disclaimer of if you want to hear me talk a little bit more about something, feel free to either jump in the chat. Sometimes I might need a lifeline or something like that to talk about different things. So what I'm gonna do, I'm just gonna go through just a little bit of background and some examples from there. So, and talk about just from some of my background in concept art and visual development and illustration, that sort of thing, and wear multiple hats and that sort of thing. So hop in, and again, thanks guys for having me, and let's jump right in. So all right, so I'm gonna jump through some stuff. This was just an image, just a kind of a character design, whereas more focused on shape and that sort of thing. And it's just a goofy thing that represents a lot of what I like, which is goofy hats and facial hair. And so you'll see that as a recurring theme through a lot of this stuff. So a little bit of an added intro. I've been in the game industry for 20 plus years. I started at Sculptured Software in Salt Lake City, working on like Super Nintendo games as an artist, like doing a lot of pixel work and that kind of thing. But currently I work at Avalanche as an art director, and I create concept art and game art and also illustration or promotional stuff. And I also teach digital painting and concept. And so I'm going to go through just maybe a few references that really got me started on my artistic journey. And early on, when I first saw Star Wars when I was young, I mean, it just blew me away, and just that environment. And so you'll see a lot of, try not to get too much of a fanboy, but I started out like really liking Star Wars. And then sort of later in my teenage years, I was into skateboarding art and that sort of, you know, really crazy drawings. And that had a big influence on wanting to do art. So it was like this combination of like Star Wars and skateboard art. And so there's a few examples of that. But and then after I kind of I went to school at Utah State University, and my painting instructor up there, Glenn Edwards, he really introduced me to a lot of the sort of classic illustrators when it came to, like these old movie posters. Like this example has NC Wyeth and Norman Rockwell as far as like drawing goes, and then also just the whole wall was covered with posters. So I'd go in there and study them, and it was like before the internet, so you could go in and study all the really cool drawings. And so that was kind of my introduction to oil painting. And so I learned sort of classically, or I guess classic as possible. That's how I learned to paint, was under that setup. And so when I was out of school, I was planning on going to illustration, and it was one of those things where my portfolio, I felt like, wasn't where it needed to be, but I was still kind of working at it on the side. And right when I got out of school, there was a small company called Sculptured in Salt Lake, and they were hiring. And so the bar actually, when I go back to then, it was like, if you could draw decent, you pretty much had a good shot of getting in. And the good thing about this is that I could start to learn the computer aspect of it ended up, it was a ton of pixel art at the first, not too exciting to show. I'm sure I could pull up examples, but you'd be kind of horrified with what they look like. And so that's how I started out and how I learned the computer. And what happened after that was I got Corel Painter, and that sort of really, once I got that and sort of a Wacom tablet, or sorry, a Wacom tablet, I always say it wrong. I don't know if anyone else always gets called out for that, but it was one of those things where once I started learning this sort of on the side, I was able to sort of get a little bit more comfortable with some of the brushes in there. It made it feel more like I was actually painting in oils. And so and one of their gimmick things early on was they were all shipped in this can. And so it was like, you knew the software. And so I had done a bunch of stuff, and I'd submitted an image to them, and they ended up using it in a promotional art. And that image, I think that it really kind of helped turn my, for one, it helped me get my artwork out there a little bit, but it also got me more connected with other people in the industry, because being in Utah is kind of isolated, and this was before you had a lot of different studios and that sort of thing. And so going to SIGGRAPH and connecting with others in the industry was really beneficial. And I think that you start to learn from people and from other artists, and so that's kind of how it started out. And so this was the image that I'd created for it. And when I look at this, there's a lot of things that I don't like about it, but at the same time, there are some things, like when it comes to using brushes and that sort of thing, that felt more like I was replicating what natural media does. And so, I mean, at the time, Photoshop kind of did it, and I'd seen some other artists that had created some really cool work, but Painter seemed like it definitely replicated that in a closer way. So this is an example of that. And this is one of those things where I got caught off guard a little bit, because they said, hey, we want to break down your process and how you create this image. And so the following tutorial was done after the fact. It's like almost cleaning up some of this stuff. And so you can see at the top left, I had just the sketch that I worked from, and then the background painted in, and then sort of the merging the two, building up color, and then sort of adding highlights. So this was kind of my first stab at trying to quantify what I did, and it helped me understand a little bit of process, and so to document it a little bit better later on. But this was one of those things where it just like, I almost had to reverse engineer it. But I really sort of appreciated the opportunity to dive into this, because like I said, it got me into a lot of different studios, as far as talking to them and learning what people look for in portfolios and that sort of thing. And so at that time, this is where, when I went to SIGGRAPH and I had talked to Avalanche Studios at the time, this was another advertisement that I had done after the Canhead one with that same software. But after that, I had talked to Avalanche, and they were hiring. So that's when I got hired on at Avalanche, and I've been there sort of ever since in some way or another. And so one of the things right after getting there was we kind of had this project on the side that everyone liked to work on, and it was called TAC and the Power of Juju. So this was a project where we kind of, I'm going to go through some examples from it, but we very clearly did not know what we were doing. We were just thinking, okay, we'll have this game that we'd like to work on. And some of the other artists that were there, Todd Harrison, Jeff Bunker, and a whole team of great artists and modelers and that sort of thing, and designers, we kind of created this thing on the side, and we were working on other projects at the time. And this sort of was our like passion project. And so we had put a lot of effort into it, and it ended up getting picked up and published by THQ. And so at the time, it was a relative success at the time, enough to where we could make 3 iterations and keep the studio going. But I had a lot of fun on it. I felt like I learned a ton of stuff. And so I'll show some examples of that. And hopefully I'm crediting everyone with the right amount of work. But just as far as building out an intellectual property, kind of putting your voice to something and adding your flavor, I think that's what we learned on it, and we had a lot of fun doing it. And so this was one of the early images that I had done where we kind of thought this main character would be sort of this, this might in retrospect seem like a ripoff of the Dark Crystal, but at the time that was kind of like our main character was going to be something like that, and it ended up shifting to something else. But this was just sort of the start of a long process. And so you can kind of see these are some, back when we were sort of tasked with the idea that we're going to create these, we'll call them jujus, and they were sort of this, it was almost like a mechanic in the property that would, and I mean intellectual property, but it would take something, a characteristic, and attach to some sort of personality, and we didn't really know what it was going to be. Like, we started out like the version on the left is sort of this vampire guy, and then the other one is sort of a Grim Reaper, and then the final version is in the middle, and it ended up being just sort of this goofy skeleton guy that has, you know, a Hawaiian shirt and that sort of thing, and just had an outsized personality. So we really leaned into some of the humorous aspects. At least it was funny to us. It was entertaining. And so in going from there, this was another version of a juju that we kind of abandoned. And then it ended up with something like this, where it was almost like a very annoying, sort of overbearing personality, but we had them, you know, just, we played with the proportions a little bit, but had a lot of fun doing it. And so this ended up being one of my favorite characters, maybe just because he was so annoying and grating. But so that was, and then also one of the components that we kind of leaned into with TAC was the whole idea that animals have something to do in the world with gameplay, or you know, and a lot of the designers talked about how to utilize that. And so this was an animal concept. We also had different tribes of characters, and this being when it was released, you know, there was only, you know, 2 really well-defined characters for each tribe. So we came up with this concept of like the different motifs for each one, and it's sort of the palette corresponds, and the sort of the symbols are retained for each tribe, and we kind of came up with that. And then so we developed that a little bit further, where you can kind of see how, I mean, these were the characters that, you know, for the 2, sorry, I messed up. So if you look at the first 2, or these middle 2 tribes that we have here, the left were more influenced by like heavy metal and, you know, like very over the top, sort of cheesy, you know, 80s metal, that we put all of that into it. And so the palette kind of reflected that, and their costuming and that sort of thing. And then the one on the right, you know, if you've seen Mad Max, you know, the Who Run Bartertown, that's definitely like a homage to that, where you just had this character that just rode around on this big sort of oafish guy all the time. So that was a lot of fun designing those. And so going from that, from sort of the characters, we focused on the characters first, and then after that, it was something where we do like a color key. In this instance, and this example was like, you know, if you look back at this palette for this, it was kind of very much in the similar vein. And one of the things is it just seemed a little bit too monochromatic. And so after that, we kind of went away from that a little bit. And this is a drawing by Todd Harris, but he kind of came up with this. It was in a swamp, and there was sort of these exposed roots and that sort of thing. So after that, you would take that, do a color pass on it to really break out what you thought the overall mood should be, and you can kind of compare that to this, where it was the palette, the overall color palette was quite different from what it ended up as. And so then what would happen is, after this, taking this to a texture sheet where we kind of broke out, and based on the limitations of the hardware at the time, we would have to sort of come up with a bunch of textures that would be used all over in the level, and that sort of keyed in on some of the visuals and that sort of thing. So we had to paint a lot of light into it. So we didn't have the benefit of, normal maps and all the, dynamic lighting. So a lot of this feels almost like generic in the way that it was lit, but then when we would put it into a level, it kind of would work out. So we kind of did this a lot, where it kind of served two purposes, where or dual purposes, where it was a piece of concept art and production art, but it also was something that you could then sort of chop up in ways and use in a level. And so we started to learn how to leverage some of that, so that since a lot of us were wearing multiple hats and like doing our own concept and working with some of the designers, it was something that ended up working out pretty well. And so these are another couple examples of some characters where they were made up of natural elements. The one on the rock is just sort of this reanimated guy that throws rocks out of his belly. And then there was also on the right-hand side, there was a tribe that was all of these like sort of carved wooden masks that was a lot of fun to do. So these are just a few examples of that. And also this kind of going back to that idea of using animals in the world. This was the first time that we really sort of leaned into the idea of having them do something. And so the bottom right is this boar. So if you'd get the boar angry, he would charge the player, and then they would knock the player over into some other unopened area. And so that was one element that I feel like was sort of added to the personality of the game, and then we could put some of that personality into the characters. And so here's an example too, where we did the concept is on the left, sort of coming up with the general shape and some of the color, and all this was sort of sketched and then painted digitally. And then you can see the top right was sort of the breakdown of the texture page. And then on the bottom right is the 3D model. And this was sort of a, back when we did this, again, we were all trying to learn different components of production. So the fun thing is we could take a character, we could do a concept of it, and we could also model it and texture it and have feel like that was our character, and we had more ownership in it. And so I think that with the way that productions are now, it's a little bit, you miss that because you need a really big team of artists and programmers and designers to make that come together. But back when we did this, I felt like we were able to sort of control enough part of the production where we could put our stamp on it. And so that's a really important thing that at this stage where we realized, you really invest a lot more as an artist when you can have that ownership of it and feel like you have input. Because I think that, the scale of things now, it gets lost a little bit, but this is where I felt like I started to get used to that a little bit better, or a little bit more. And so, whether this is a mark of shame or a mark of triumph was when we started to do some of these images, and this is some characters that I designed early on, and I was able to build them, and then, they turned into Happy Meal toys, which I realized, it's not, but at the time it was something that I got really happy about, because seeing something that was designed in the computer and then made into a 3D object, I think is something that was cool to see. So, and jumping from that, so that was sort of when I got started at Avalanche, and later on there was sort of, I know Nicholas, you kind of alluded to it, but there was sort of an era of blogs. And so some of the work that I'm going to walk through here is just art that came out of that era. And so there were sort of two things that came out from it, which was more of a sense of camaraderie with the artists in the studio, but also as individuals, getting your name out there to, like, whether it's if you're doing I add some illustration examples in here that I had done that were based on stuff that I had put out on the blog. And so I'll just show a few examples, and if you want me to slow down and talk about any of them, I can. But so this was sort of a I really like historical portraits or an old sort of, you know, artifacts that have been, you know, dusty and musty and have all this layers of grit. And so this might have been sort of overdone that way, but these were just these sort of imaginary characters that I came up with that helped start when I started a blog. I would post this kind of work. So you can kind of see this was the mishmash of ideas where you have alfalfa plus the Misfits plus Frankenstein equaled this kind of goofy character. So it was one of those things where it ended up being sort of, it wasn't necessarily weekly, but it was like a practice that you could just do after you were done with work. And so that's where a lot of this stuff kind of came from. Some of this was based on, you know, music lyrics, and this was based on a Merle Haggard song, Mama Tried. So this was like a quick sort of sketch. And then I don't have all of the stages in it, but that was sort of the beginning of it, very simple shape. And then sort of adding lighting and, you know, a slight hint of location. That's where this ended up. Another one where I was watching a documentary and they were talking about the Hessian soldiers and how the helmets, when they'd see them sort of emerge from the forest, it was just this terrifying sight. But I just thought it was funny, just that imagery. And so it kind of inspired me to do this sort of thing. So a lot of these are sort of inspiration from either something that I saw one day, or and it was really good practice to do. And so kind of going from that, the version on the left, I ended up as a studio, and this was sort of later on, we ended up working on Epic Mickey with a sister studio in Austin. And one of the things that they did is they recreated a bunch of the classic Disney things. And I was able to do one of those, which was a blast to do, even though it's, you know, I look at it now, I'm like, oh, I would have changed that. But it was fun to do at the time. And then just on the right, it's just a band poster that I'd come up with. And then it even infected the rest of the things. Like I used to, and I don't want to offend anyone that does fantasy football, but I was into it for a while and I wanted to come up with a sort of a team name and logo. So that's what this was. So I don't do that anymore because I got a little bit too into it, but because it's a lot of fun if you're like, you know, crunching numbers and that sort of thing. And yeah, it was, anyway, so that's where you kind of see some of this, where some of this would come through. But I kind of used it as practice again, just outside of work time. That was kind of a good, you know, break from everything. These were a couple, you know, more along the lines of that historical sort of approach. The one on the right, Cervantes, and then Annie Oakley. Happy New Year. Got to have, if you ever lack something to draw, you can always draw holiday things. That's what that was. And I ended up doing sort of a lot of witches at this phase. So again, just had some goofy fun with either a color palette or some basic designs. Again, you know, you can add Christmas into the mix, and you can do, you know, what would a Christmas in Texas look like? And so that's what these characters sort of started out as. And then, so I'm going to show a few examples too from the Avalanche blog. And this was sort of, it's still up and you can kind of go through some of these old things, but we did like these Old West wanted posters was the subject one time. You know, again, another holiday. So, you know, just trying to do your own spin on it, I think is something fun to do if you're sort of feel like you're needing some like a prompt for creating something. Another witch. I ended up starting this project and abandoning it quickly once I realized how many cards there would be to do in a deck. So, you know, I only have a handful of these, but here was a couple that I felt like at least sort of set some color palette information, or that I could sort of key in on. Yeah, more of that. I do have a tutorial of this, but it's very simplistic. There's not a lot of stuff, but this is again was sort of one of those times where I was trying out, you know, painting. I can't paint and talk at the same time, but this was sort of an attempt at showing some of that process. Here was another sort of blog post topic talking about robots, and then you always got to have, you know, a grotesque version of an existing IP, and so this was my take on Mario. Another one, again, goofy hairs, goofy hats and facial hair. It always ends up in that. And this one was Creatures of the Deep. So kind of coming up with an idea of this sort of weathered, historic, fictional creature with some, that's wearing like a nice sort of Western suit there. Combining the idea of Cookie Monster with the kaiju. So a lot of these are more character based. This one was sort of like just the general blog topic was Snow Monster. So I had a lot of fun working on these, and so I'm just putting these in there. So one of the things that and I'm going to show some illustration work, and there is sort of a definite distinction between concept art and illustration and visual development work. And so hopefully with some of these examples, they may not be quite as finished as others, but they all have sort of different applications. And so what this is it was an ad for a, some of those pre-made, those things you get at gas station, and they wanted the character here to be holding it like it's a shotgun. And I mean, it was a lot of fun to do. It was kind of silly. And it was my first time ever doing some illustration work like that on the site. And it had to be cut up in a way that made it into a fold-up display, which I never saw how it, like what the final display looked like, but it had all of these sort of specifications that it needed to hit to fold up correctly. And so I think that was, again, another exposure to how things, you could create art where you don't have to put all of the detail in, just where it's sort of visible and important. And so that transition, some of these examples are for book covers. This was an initial, it's for a young adult novel series. And this was the first in the series called The Last Dragon Slayer. And they basically had this creature in there, and I'll show another version of this, but they had this creature, or it was like a dragon, and they said, hey, we want you to go, full bore and put all this detail in, but then not show most of it. And so I put as much detail as I possibly could in the tail and stuff, but and then I don't draw a lot of cars, and so I had to put a VW in there, which was a little bit of a challenge. But anyway, so this was the first of the series, and then the next version, it was something like, hey, we want to show more of like this different creature. And so these drawings and sketches on the left-hand side were the initial ones that I sent, where I'm like, oh, okay, I get to design this really goofy creature that has all these cool textures on it. And they sent it back and said, no, that we want it to be hiding a little bit more. And then so the one that they approved is on the bottom right, where I didn't even get to draw and have fun with any of the detail and stuff. And it was just ended up like this, like 2 glowing eyes, really. So a lot of times where, you start out with an idea in mind, and then just the direction changes a little bit and you end up in a completely different place. I mean, there's some things that I like about this, but it's one of those things where it just kind of like, I was going to have a lot of fun with it. And then I also put a homage to my old can that I would put in everything. And I don't know if that's a recurring theme or not, but so that was the second book in the series, and that ended up turning into this one as well, which again, I kind of like, I struggled with the vehicle, but it was a lot of fun to do. So that was sort of a little bit of the illustration stuff. This project was it was for it was one of the side Nickelodeon channels that had a weekend lineup of programming where you had this, they call it like the 3-headed monster, where there was on the left you have Friday, you have Saturday, and then on the right you have Sunday. And so this representation of the 3 sort of different personalities of those, going into the weekend and that sort of thing. And so this was a lot of fun to do. Again, this is the first time I'd ever sort of ventured out into that, other than, so, and just to pause and go back to TAC a little bit. TAC was developed originally as a video game, but later on it was turned into a TV series. So a lot of the development work that we did on the visuals and the concept ended up getting used in the TV version. And so that again sort of exposed us a little bit to how some of the studios work and what they need for production and that sort of thing. But had a lot of fun doing it, learned a lot, made a lot of mistakes too. But this wasn't part of that, but it was through Nickelodeon, and they did this sort of setup, and these didn't end up getting used. I think they went in a different direction, but again, I had a lot of fun with it. Here's another, let's see. I ended up turning it into this. This is the black and white version, and then there's the color. So again, it was fun to have that design to play with a little bit and turn it into something that I felt like represented like my sensibilities as an artist. But yeah, just had a lot of fun. So I don't have a ton of examples from Infinity, but this was an initial example, and there were a lot of different artists that kind of came together and created this. And so some of the examples that I'm going to show are related to this, a little bit less. I mean, the characters, I think there's a lot of stuff out there, and but I wanted to show a few examples that sort of met the challenge of taking an existing intellectual property and then sort of putting into the same world. And so this was an initial concept of, again, all of these characters are sort of different artists put together. So one of the sort of key things that if you've played the game or anything like that, notice that, you know, a lot of the big seams and that sort of thing were something that we needed to set these apart, because Mr. Incredible already has like a very stylized design and really cool shapes. And so to set that off a little bit, to like add some visible seams from a distance is what we're going for. So this was an initial concept of that. The final version ended up being a little bit different, but this is sort of one of the early ones. And so transitioning from that, one of the early roles that I had just as an art director was to take the existing Monsters University assets from the film and then try to make them into a world. And so this was one thing where I felt like we were really lucky to have a good working relationship with the fine folks at Pixar, and just I'm blown away at their talent and their ability, and just it was really inspiring to work with them and have them help us. And we never felt like we were just the video game studio. We always felt like we were a partner, and they trusted us a lot with artistic decisions. And so that was one thing that I really enjoyed about working on this. And when I look back on it, yeah, sure, there's some things that I would change, but I think in general, it was a really great experience. And so, so this is sort of the toyified version of the Monsters University campus. And this was the gameplay that we'd come up with. And one of the things that they allowed us to do, or at least encourage us to do, is sort of come up with this whole side campus of, in the film, the rival is Fear Tech, right? It's sort of this opposing university that they are always playing pranks on. In fact, that's what the gameplay in this was about like just pranks, college pranks, that sort of thing. All of the visuals in it were very sort of in contrast with the sort of Ivy League aesthetic of Monsters University, where everything's got a history to it, it's overgrown and that sort of thing. So these are a couple of screenshots of that you can contrast with the previous version. This is the video game version. You'd have characters that walked around campus, and you would set up traps in these like a bulletin board, and it would boot you out. And so one of the things, so we thought, okay, well, we have this Disney Infinity style, and there's a gameplay need for this big sort of almost like a UPS character that's going to fly into the scene, and it's going to present the player with this element of like a power up or something like that. And so, we went through multiple iterations of this. I don't have all of them, but this was one where it was like, okay, we're going to exaggerate the seams of those wings, and it's going to be really cool. It's going to have like this whale thing, and it's going to have this toy tail that wags around, and one of those snake things. And we're talking about all this different articulation for this. And, we thought, and so we presented that to the team at Pixar, and they're like, well, that was a cool explanation, but what does it do? It's like, well, it delivers things. It's like, okay, well, why don't you just make it into a mailbox? And so it was like, they showed up, they was like, yeah, just make it a mailbox, right? We're like, oh man, we totally overthought it. And so that was the design decision. And so that's what we did. We just said, okay, we're going to take that basic shape of the mailbox and just put some monstery textures on it and make it a little bit more gross, and have like letters flying off to reinforce that story idea. So that was one thing that we really came away with, was like, hey, yeah, sometimes you do overthink things, and just the simplest way is the best. And so it kind of ended up that the model, this is sort of the block out model before the animation sort of went on top of it, but it ended up like that in the final game, where it just would fly into the level over the player and it'd spit out the box and then fly away. And it was just sort of this big beast. But that was one of those things where it was a lot of fun to work on. It was a lot of fun to implement. And again, it just felt like we had a lot of input from the artists at Pixar to make that come together. So, and the other sort of element to this is we could design the Fear Tech campus of, like, it's rivalry week or something like that. So we had stuff like this where banners of like crushing the competition and that sort of thing. So yeah, so jumping back to Star Wars, because this is sort of one of those recurring themes. I would do art on the blog and that sort of thing. And so that's what's kind of funny about this is, around the same time that we were doing blog stuff, we did create like a company blog where we would do sort of, whatever goofy, I showed some of those, we'd do the goofy subject of the day, but one of them was stupid Star Wars characters or dumb Star Wars characters. And, this is my post for it. And like, so I have to tell this story because, one, I still can't believe that it's happened, and it still blows me away. So so I posted this big dumb goofy thing of Bib Fortuna, haha. And so that was what I posted, was just this. It was sort of a goofy, like, one-off thing. And then I got an email from someone at Lucasfilm, and they said, hey, we're putting together like people's interpretations of Star Wars. And I'm like, well, I was just like kind of a goof. I didn't really, it's like a digital painting, like, well, it would be way cooler if that was like an oil painting, that then you could sort of, that way it'd be more traditional and stuff. So it actually kind of spurred me on to do a original oil painting based on this. And so that was what I ended up painting up, and I hadn't painted for a while. And so it was a lot of fun. And I ended up putting this, and this ended up in the Star Wars book. And so it was one of those things where it just feels like what I learned from that is, sometimes you feel like you might have a throwaway idea that might not mean anything, but it's important to just, maybe sometimes you don't want to post it, but it's one of those things where at least sort of write it down so that you have something for the time. And so that was one thing that I really enjoyed about this project, was it sort of reinforced that idea. And so that kind of led to a few other things, like this one. There was a tribute to the Coen brothers exhibition. This was ended up, I think they showed it up in Seattle, but this was, of course, from Raising Arizona, one of the characters there. So I always tell people to watch this movie because it's just like, it's a lot of fun. It's highly quotable. And so this was like the villain in that movie. And this was an image that I had made for Nico in the Sword of Light. It was an animated TV show. I think it's on Amazon, but Bobby Chu and Kay Esadera that kind of created it. And gosh, and I can't remember its last name is Bryson, I think. But they came up with this idea, and it's they kind of had artists do their take on what they think might be Nico. And so this was like him sort of fighting all the monsters that are in that world. This is after Christopher Lee passed away, and I loved his role as Saruman, and he's just got a really cool face. This was an illustration job that was for the Miami New Times / Village Voice, and it was about the cigar production in Cuba during Castro, and it sort of had a lot of things of, and part of the story is like some of these sanctions and that sort of thing were blowing up in his face, and so they wanted an illustration of that, and so this was sort of a chance to illustrate that. But I had a lot of fun working on it. This was another illustration project that was sort of based on a historical, and that's the thing, is a lot of this kind of led from or spawned from a blog, and so it wasn't like anything where I had to go out and get a representative or anything like that. It's sort of, that's the nice thing about the internet, is really you can start to create some of that for yourself. And so this was an example of that, where I was able to do this cover, and this was the first time I had really sort of done that. I mean, all those other book covers, I didn't do figures on them. And so this was my first chance at doing that. And also, I'm a big fan of old historical portraits, like I mentioned, and just like Civil War. If you're feeling like you want to draw something, there's tons of inspiration in that, because, I just love the grizzled old face of General Sherman here with the, really patchy beard and that sort of thing. And so, okay, so this was another project that I ended up losing the original too, just because the computer got corrupted. So this is my only sort of representation of the final artwork. This was like an Art of Minnie Mouse book back when they had artists at Disney, different divisions of Disney. I was at the interactive group, but we would create sort of images for this book. And so that's the final image is not something that I have. This was sort of the work in progress. And so the important thing was save backups of your work, no matter where you put them. This was almost like a direct rip off of the old Powell Peralta Bones Ripper that I'm sure you kind of seen. It kind of made a resurgent combined with the Grinch. Again, this is more studies that were done from just old. This is Once Upon a Time in the West, which is a great film. You should check that out too. And you can't get better face than Lee Van Cleef. So ended up having a lot of drawings of him as a character. And also old baseball cards. This is Honus Wagner and Yogi Berra. So, and also this sort of ties into the creature design too. In the concept class, this one's a fun character to sort of work on because it has really bold shapes in it and also just gnarly looking texture. And so, I mean, yeah, there's so many cool things about alligator snapping turtles if you just want to like draw something, be inspired to draw some. So this was a design that was based on that. And so I wanted to, so that's a lot of the work that I've done over the years, but I also wanted to talk a little bit about sort of, as an artist, you want to keep yourself inspired to create stuff every day. And it's really hard, especially now. I mean, it's one of those things where, it's just sort of a challenge. And so this is from a while back, but I ended up sort of wanting to get better at painting environments and sort of adding to, being constantly learning things. And so I'll show you some of the experiments. Hopefully it's interesting to you. I felt like I learned a lot from it. And in my classes, I use this as an example to sort of walk through where it's okay if you don't know something about a certain subject, and you can always learn. And there's always it seems like there's endless amounts of information to learn out there. So this was an experiment where I sat down and said, okay, every day from the office, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do these window studies and try to see if I can improve those. And so whether that's successful or not, you can judge for yourself. But this is sort of the start of that. And this was the first one that I did where I was sort of looking west towards the Wasatch Mountain Range. And there's so many colors there that I felt like I just needed to start to break it down to the basic shapes. And so that's why it wasn't totally successful, but I felt like, okay, I'm going to stick with this. I'm going to keep going. And this is another version of just digital painting where I tried to block in the big shapes and that sort of thing and capture the lighting as best I could. The snow was kind of melting at that time. So simplifying how you would represent snow in the background. And I feel like, this kind of stuff, even though it might not be sort of have the impact of a finished illustration or anything like that, what it can do is it can kind of train you to meet that challenge as quick as possible to capture like a certain lighting, and it will sort of inform your visual library that you're constantly building and looking at, with whether your influences that you have, all of that kind of stuff. You can try to, or it adds to that. And so these are just a few more examples, again, from the same spot, just looking in slightly different directions, and the weather was constantly different, lighting, time of day. This one, in fact, when the sun would set, you would get these really intense reflections that would just like cast this almost like a piercing, glowing light off in the distance. And so it was sort of one of those recurring themes. So these are a couple of examples of that. And this one, I tried not to ever like copy and paste, except for this one day where the light was going down really quick. And so I copied and pasted, and this is about 10 minutes later, and you can kind of see how the light changed that much in color, you know, intensity, saturation, just in that short period of time. And then this was another challenge where I was trying to get, from my vantage point, I was looking up, this is from like downtown Salt Lake. So I was looking up the hill, and there's a lot of undulation in that terrain, and it doesn't really, it's not just like a linear flow. And so I had a little bit of difficulty trying to draw that. And so that's what ended up looking when I was looking up the hill there. Another version where trying to capture very specific type of lighting where the clouds were coming in and lightning was going off in one side, and then on the right hand side of the view you had like blue skies. And so this is what I ended up, this was a one that I did later where I was focused more about sort of the abstract shapes rather than a specific building or anything like that. So these are just a couple more of examples of that. Sorry, I can't talk. So one of the challenges that I ran into with this, and these are a few more examples of some of the grayscale things that I tried to paint, was the challenges were rapidly changing lighting conditions, you know, and trying to, again, capture that as best you can, and just building that visual library. And it was really hard to translate that color into a corresponding value. Again, with it changing all the time, that was one of the things that I would constantly run into. And also the detail can be overwhelming. You know, sometimes it's easier to just blur your eyes a little bit so you can start to consolidate some of those shapes rather than, you know, trying to tackle the whole thing like a cityscape. And also the perspective on rough terrain can be pretty tricky. And so I just wanted to talk a little bit about that as far as just, you know, something to help sort of, you know, build your visual library as much as possible. And I'm sure, you know, that you've done like other exercises that might be similar, but this is one where I felt like I learned a lot, and it sort of kept me, it rejuvenated my love for art. And so those are just a few examples of that. I just wanted to jump to that and talk a little bit about if there's a Q&A session, or if there are, you know, questions you want me to go back to on any of those things. I realize I kind of talked a little bit fast through some of that, but
let's see, guys, if you have any questions, throw them up. I've got a few off the bat.
Yeah.
Who's your favorite skate deck artist? You have one in particular? You mentioned that as one of your big influences.
Yeah, it would be VC Johnson and Jim Phillips. Those two are just like, and also Pusshead. Pusshead was a big influence too. That did all the like the Metallica covers and the comic books. Yeah, I couldn't get enough of that when I was in high school.
Do you still collect decks? Do you have like clean ones that you've bought since?
No. I sadly like a Lance Mountain was my last like a really solid deck, like, and that was after he left Powell. And so yeah, I don't have any of that around anymore.
I have a couple of questions I'm reading in the chat. Before I ask my question, I'll ask Josephine is asking, you seem to have a lot of paintings where the colors flow from one end to the other from the color wheel. What is your process for deciding what colors to use in a piece? And do you have any tips for students who wish to learn more about using color? Okay,
yeah, that's a good question. I think that again, when I brought up the NC Wyeth example, like I think if you try to find high resolution images of that paint application, I ended up learning a ton from NC Wyeth and Norman Rockwell and Frank Frazetta. Like I think a lot of people get hung up on the subject matter, but if you look at his paintings and how dynamic and solid the characters are, and just the color transitions, I think that just looking and studying their work, I feel like that influenced me to try to get that, because it's one of those things where like I'm not the best at like color theory, because I've read up a lot, and sometimes it's one of those things that you do overthink, but it's almost just like you put an initial color down and then you start mixing things into it. And that was one of the things that Painter that I thought did really well early on, where you did get some mixing of like almost smearing. And so you would get these little artifacts there that would be sort of fun to explore how those color relationships worked. But yeah, I don't know if that totally answers your question, because color is always it's like a big, I mean, I feel like I'm still learning stuff about color all the time. And so, yeah, I would just check out those 3 artists that they have a really good color sense.
Another question is, do you have any tutorials, or do you recommend any tutorials?
I linked a few in the chat. The ones that were available online that you showed real quick, Ryan, those are linked in the chat. If you just dig up through there, there's an image of just the process that you showed of the paint can gentleman, and there's also an old YouTube video of you working in Painter that I linked in there. I don't know if there's any others you want to direct them to. But.
Yeah, those are those are one of those things where I felt like I was just sort of learning and putting it out there. But that's where you see sort of a sped up version. And I'm also trying to learn, like I don't use Painter as much anymore. Like I think Photoshop does a pretty good job, and I'm also trying to learn Procreate on the iPad. There's some really cool brushes as far as like blending. If you do get a chance, check out the Max Packs if you haven't already for those brushes in Procreate are awesome. Like there's really good ink brushes and like gouache, just good texture, that sort of thing. But yeah, so tutorials, I would check out Schoolism. They have a lot of great tutorials on there. Some of them are just free up on their YouTube channel of, some really great artists that are up there. Yeah, I know on Gumroad there's quite a few too, if you search for artists there.
I think they were specifically asking if you had any other that were.
Oh, if I did. No, I'm trying to deflect, and because yeah, I don't really have any. I mean, when I started teaching in person, I didn't really develop that any further, but because I was teaching for a little while on Schoolism, but it was one of those things where I think not enough people use Painter, and most everyone uses Photoshop. It's kind of the industry standard now. But yeah, so I just have kind of a few limited things up there.
I have a question from Cecilia. This is a good question too. How do you How do you handle time management for your work versus for fun projects?
That's a good question. It's one of those things.
I would like to know too.
Well, lately the answer is not good. I haven't been doing good managing that time to create art, because you'll notice a lot of this art is fairly old now. But it's one of those things where I've always said that it's if you at least carve out like an hour or so every day, and maybe you're not posting that on the internet, but just at least if you have something for yourself, and like an hour, you can always, well, not all the time you can spare, but it's one of those things where if you just sort of get into that habit, you can do, and that's honestly, that's what this painting project did, for like drawing landscapes, where I feel like I have so much to learn there that I'll just sort of keep doing that. And so finding something that you're not good at, I think is a good motivation, especially if you're not thinking about posting it. Like if you just say, okay, I'm just going to do this and learn this particular thing, no matter, how painful it is. And so if everyone here, I mean, we all chose art for some reason, and we all sort of accept that there's going to be some pain that comes along with like just the constant struggle when you're fighting all of the different components of creating an image or any sort of art creation. I think that has that component to it.
Let's see what else. We got some other questions here. How long were you spending on those studies that you were doing from your window there? The vantage point studies? I think someone had asked that.
Those were anywhere from 10 minutes to half an hour. And sometimes I would go back and touch them up and that sort of thing, but usually it was pretty short.
You have another one from Emma. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Oh. When you're working on a production or on a tight deadline, what's your secret to staying focused on that project and not to get distracted by side projects, and how to not suffer burnout on a deadline?
Yeah, man, you're asking all the tough ones. That's the thing is like a deadline is an incredible motivator. So you can either you just get used to that pressure. Sometimes it is one of the, it's definitely a challenge. I don't think I have ever a good solution to that. It's just one of those in fact, I actually like deadlines because I think the worst thing is if you're working on something, you say, oh, just take however long you need, that's like, at least for me, when I'm managing my time, that's like the worst thing to say, because then you're like, oh, well, I can just take forever and I can spend all this time rendering out like the fingernail or whatever it may be, And so, I mean, I do feel like for me personally, it's really good to have clear deadlines, and that's a good motivator. And especially, when you're doing freelance and you want to get paid, that's like that's definitely one of those things. And to the second part, I guess I think avoiding burnout. I think it's hard because one of the things as artists too is we get inspired by a lot of different things, whether it's other games or if it's films or other artists. There's so much that you can do that sometimes it's just there all the time. And so for burnout, I mean, like another thing that I started doing recently a few years back and sort of reconnecting with was fly fishing, and so kind of finding a hobby that's totally unrelated to art. And I think that the cool thing about it is, it, at least for me, it's one of those things where you're out, you're not in a studio or you're not looking at a screen, you're just sort of out in nature and seeing all the different things that are happening, much like those studies. You notice how rich our world is and how many things that you can get influenced by. And I think it's inspiring. And so getting inspiration that way that feels like it's not art related, but it actually is, and it can kind of inform you as a person. In fact, that's one of the things that was really cool when we went to Pixar, and they talked about that, of like, they said, hey, the best thing to do is have a life outside of here, because then it will inform your art. It will make you a better artist, and it will make you more genuine, more believable, and that sort of thing. So yeah, I'd say, do get a hobby and something that you totally would know nothing about. And I think that's what can be inspiring.
Two more questions. Do you still do traditional work? And also, do you think it's appropriate to post sketches and visual development concepts online, like in LinkedIn or Instagram, that are not finished? Do you think that recruiters like seeing those type of sketches?
Yeah, that's a good one. I don't do a ton of traditional anymore. If I do, it's mostly like drawing or pen and ink, like a full-on oil painting. Like I haven't tackled one of those for a while. I have been getting out to do again, landscape painting, but I'm just still working in grayscale, like on just like index cards, doing value studies with markers. So that's about as close to traditional that I've been lately. And then on the part where you posting finished as opposed to unfinished, I think as long as you present the steps that you're taking with it, that's what's important. Because a lot of times, at least when I was interviewing, when we were interviewing artists, it would be like you could see their thought process. So even if something was unfinished, if it was in context with other imagery that shows sort of the beginning and then where you would take it, I think that's definitely very cool to see. In fact, I would rather see that than like some sort of like really cool environment that has a ton of detail in it, and like they spent like 120 hours on it or something like that. So yeah, showing that development part of it, even if it's unfinished, I think is good. And that's kind of counterintuitive, because I think we've been trained, and I'm kind of guilty of this as well. Is like, well, I don't really want to post that because people aren't going to like whatever my exploration is here as far as like visually. But I think it's good to post showing that in context as a progression piece, if that makes sense.
I love to see that. I mean, I would love to see the progression and all the studies too.
Yeah, I think it's definitely one of those things where we try to cut out the bad stuff that we don't want people to see, and it's like, here's this perfect thing that I've done. It's definitely like there's it's one of those things that's hard to sort of break from, I guess.
Let's see, we're going to do only a couple more questions.
I think we had one that was asking, how would you differentiate a portfolio that's geared towards animation versus games versus illustration? Like, is there anything that would vary those up in terms of a presentation or types of materials you would include?
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where it's when you see a portfolio that just has a lot of different things. Like I know, you know, if you have some ZBrush work and you have some work in like Substance Painter and you have some in Maya, it's like it's one of those things that it's hard to see what your voice is. So that can get lost somewhat. And so as far as like, you know, illustration work versus all of those other things, I always think illustration just has more polish to it. Whereas if you were going to, and since I've only worked with some of the other studios, not internally, like when we were part of Disney, I'm not sure how applicable what I'm saying is to like film studios or, you know, TV studios. I can just share my perspective from games is more showing that process, and the looser the better in some instances, not always, but just showing that progression. I think when we looked for artists, that's what we would look for as far as presentation goes. I don't know, that probably veered off a little bit from the question there, but are you thinking more of like the work or what you would put in, or?
Yeah, I think they were just curious if there was any difference in terms of subject or type of material, or even just presentation format. So it sounds like it's just a matter of showing more process, in particular with the Viz Dev kind of game or animation work versus like illustration.
Yeah, and I think that to your point, Chris, is like the on ArtStation, when you see somebody post something, if it's a model and you see different angles of it and different lighting scenarios, just seeing, I think that helps show usage. And so I think that's the downside of illustration too, is it's like, bam, here's this image and that's all it is. It's not, there's nothing else to it. And I think that showing, you know, whether it's a prop, whether it's a character, whether it's, you know, like just a really cool background painting, it could be as simple as that. Just showing how its usage could be, and sort of the fact that you thought it out, I think is what's important. And I say that as like someone that wouldn't, like, half of this stuff I probably wouldn't put in my portfolio. Like it would be something where, you know, I kind of keep it cordoned off of like personal work versus like a development piece where I feel like, okay, I'm building out a world here, and this is this portion of it, and it has, you know, some certain goals that you're trying to achieve. Like I mentioned, you know, there's a big need for prop design and, you know, more specifically world building, that sort of thing. So that's what I would put in there.
Okay.
Rather than like super uber polished stuff. I mean, it's good to have that because I think that it shows your technical ability, but I think that not showing that thought process, I think, is sometimes a downside.
I was reading two more questions. I'm going to blend them into one. It says, is freelance better than working in a studio? And once you start working as a freelance artist, what are the ways that you can gain more clients?
So that's what's tricky, is I think that so I've had a really varying mileage with the freelance stuff, because sometimes they can pay you a lot for a job, but they'll require like a ton of iteration on it. And so it ends up not being a pleasant experience. But then on the other hand, sometimes you might make very little, but you have full creative control, and it's just a lot more rewarding to work on. But it's one of those things where, you know, building a rapport with different things, and keep in mind, like for me, I had the luxury of not doing that full time. I was sort of dabbling in it. So maybe I don't have the best advice when it comes to that, but it's one of those things where at least at the time I was able to work with a few people that I thought it was pretty rewarding. And then just sort of that recurring theme. I know sometimes just hitting the pavement, and like when I was in school, they sort of encouraged you to go sort of talk with all of these different art directors and different publishers and that sort of thing. But and so there was a lot more connection between that. Whereas now that everything's online, you can very quickly, you can say, oh, hey, who's someone that works at Disney Feature? I can find them out and email them, and maybe they'll answer your question, maybe not, but it doesn't hurt to, there's a lot more sort of connectivity that way, and it's a lot easier to approach someone. And I found that early on, where I went to like this concept art workshop in Seattle, and I was sort of afraid to ask any questions, but then I was like, hey, we're all artists here. We're going to start asking questions. It's not a big deal, It's like, I don't know.
We have one more. How do you get conversant with the tools like Photoshop? Sometimes the tools don't give me the desired effect.
That's where it's such a personalized thing, right? Where you're finding a handful, like I would say, just do like a handful of brushes. I think that sometimes there's a misconception. It's good at when you're starting out, I think, to have the choice of like, okay, if I find one brush, I would say do like that experiment of like trying out a bunch of brushes, but then just say, okay, I'm just going to use these 5 brushes or whatever it is. I mean, heck, I've got a lot of mileage out of just the basic pen tool for blocking in things. I think that's part of the thing that I probably failed to mention, but a lot of the development is like art direction, and some of the development is very rough. It doesn't have like some of the level of finish and some of the examples that I've shown. Like, it's just, you're using the pencil in Photoshop to just block it in and say, okay, move this over here and make this bigger, and sort of scale relationships. But I think as far as learning Photoshop or whatever other digital program, it can sort of feel daunting. But I think that there's a few limited tools in there that you can get a ton of mileage from. So so I guess, what was the other part of the question? Was that like sometimes the
Toro, he was saying that sometimes the tools, they don't give him the desired effect that he's looking for.
Okay, I guess that's one thing where the desired effect, like if your goal is to like maybe take like if you saw somebody that inked really well or something like that, is sort of reverse engineering it, or like I guess maybe that's your question, is like if you were trying to recreate a specific thing, like a desired effect, sometimes it's good to have that goal. Like if you just ask yourself, okay, what painting am I shooting for? How would I reverse engineer it? And I think that's where there's so many brushes out there that you can use that yeah, I think it can get daunting sometimes to have too many choices. But I would say just keep working at it, because so much of at least digital painting in my mind is just getting used to that, the way that you make a mark on the screen, like whether it's a Cintiq or whether it's just a standalone tablet. It's just getting used to that muscle memory. So it's probably not the best answer, but that's what I'd say for that.
It's true. We have.
I think I had one that kind of spun off of that question, in terms of how important do you feel like your traditional education was in terms of learning the digital tools? Because you said you went to school for illustration and primarily sounded like oil painting. How did that impact your kind of adopting digital?
Honestly, I thought it was invaluable because I wasn't sort of, I think right now there's so many things to learn, like, and I still feel that today, right? Like, oh, I've got to learn another component of ZBrush, and I've got to learn how to do like building stuff out in Maya or Unreal or whatever. There's so many tools. Like, you could easily spend years studying one thing that might change. And so I think that the benefit of working traditionally is you have all of those years of like trial and error that you're learning from people that have done it just for a long time. And so I'm really grateful that I had the benefit of that early on, because I think that it helped make my digital art better. And I would still say that today, where if you do work completely digitally, that's totally cool. Try to take that and maybe do some traditional stuff. And I think that that informs it. In fact, like doing sculpture and that sort of thing really helps you as a painter, because you're seeing how to sort of render out forms and see things in a way that from multiple angles. It's almost like you can start to rotate those things in your head. And when you make a 2D image, it sort of makes it more believable. So I would definitely say, if you have been doing stuff digital, work in a sort of traditional component. And it could be very specific, like sculpture or, pen and ink, something like that. I definitely encourage that for sure.
And I think to close, we don't have any more questions, but I have one more question that I like to ask every single lecturer that comes to the school. Is when you were in school and when you were starting out, how many hours a day were you drawing and painting?
Oh gosh, I'm having to go way back then. So I guess the benefit is when I'm single and not just have all of my energies focused on that. Like it was, probably, I would say, not full time, but like a lot of like after, like if I was off of work or something like that. For one of the jobs that I had, I worked for the Forest Service in Idaho for a fisheries biologist. And so during the day, I was out and about, but then when I would come back, and this was when I was still going to school, but I would just draw at night all the time. And so, that would pile up at the end of the, I'd say easily 20 hours a week. So outside of, I wasn't doing art for a living back then. So,
So when you weren't working, you were drawing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not much to do too at night where I was at. So it's either that or just read books. So both of which were good.
All right. I think we don't have any more questions. And I think I speak on behalf of everyone that it was a pleasure to hear you talking about your work. I know I've been an admirer of your work for a long time, since the times of blogs. And it was cool to see a bunch of your images. You remind me of when I saw them when I was looking at the blog, like the ones with the gems and the witches. It remind me, because I haven't seen them in a long time. And today I went to the blog and I looked you up, and I saw a bunch of those images, which was cool. So thank you so much, Ryan. The information that you gave us is invaluable for all of us. And it was a pleasure to have you here. I don't know, Chris, if you want to say something else.
Oh, thank you.
Just to reiterate Dick's point, we've been a big fan. I know he and I have been fans since we were in school. So it's actual absolute pleasure to get a chance to harass you into doing this. it's for purely
you guys
selfish
are too
reasons. Nice. So thank you again. I know the students were super excited beforehand, and it sounds like they're still very excited. So again, thanks again from all of us at the school.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Thanks for hearing me go on for as much as that. So wish you the very best and take care. Be safe out there.
Thank you so much.
You too, Ryan. Much appreciated. Take care.
Thanks.
Bye.